Welcome to day 5 of the Sociology Guide 2022 challenge. In this challenge, I look to answer 20 marks of questions each weekday for the AQA A-level sociology papers. Today we're looking at education. The way the 2022 challenge works is I set a question in the morning through my Twitter feed and through my Instagram, and also the night before through my website. What I do is I then look to answer those questions and post them either through a video like this, or I post them as a blog post on my website. And you can get the written version from the website. So let's look at the questions that we've put up today. Now, today being Saturday, it's a different day that we normally do. Normally we only do Monday to Friday, but because it was the first week, I did one on Saturday as well. 3 questions worth 20 marks. The first one's worth 4 marks. Outline and explain 2 ways in which educational policies have attempted to reinforce social solidarity. I gave a couple of hints at the end of the last video on how you might answer that. Question number 2, outline and explain 3 ways in which governments have tried to tackle inequality in educational achievement. Again, I gave some hints on this one. And question number 3, read the item and answer the question that follows. Item A, according to functionalists, the purpose of education is to prepare pupils for their future roles in society. This can be achieved through the teaching of specific skills or through transmitting norms and values. Applying material from item A, analyse 2 ways in which education prepares pupils for their future roles in society. Let's look at my responses to today's challenge. First of all, we'll look at question 1. Outline and explain 2 ways in which educational policies have attempted to reinforce social solidarity. So I've gone with 2 different policies here. One way in which educational policies have looked to reinforce social solidarity is through the introduction of British values into schools. Now, the way these questions are marked, it's worth 4 marks. It's broken down into 2 marks for each way. And for each way, you get 1 mark for identifying it and 1 mark for explaining it. So I've got 1 mark here for identifying British values as a way in which social solidarity is reinforced in schools. The values of democracy, rule of law, respect and tolerance and individual liberty look to reinforce social solidarity by demonstrating to pupils they are part of a wider society and encourage social cohesion by giving pupils guidelines for how to act within that society. There's my explanation. That's my +1. So I've got 2 marks for the first part. The second one, a second way in which educational policies have looked to reinforce social solidarity is through changes to the history curriculum in 2015. As identified by Durkheim, history is uniquely placed to enable pupils to understand the bonds that bring people together. And these changes, that obviously refers to the history curriculum in 2015, enforced the teaching of the history of Britain, what Michael Gove called an island story, or Britain through the ages. So it's reinforced this idea that we belong to part of a wider society. You could have also brought in the British citizenship programme that was brought in by David Cameron. Although it's not technically an education policy, it was aimed at young people. You probably would be credited for something like that because it was run a lot through schools, and this reinforces social solidarity, encourages people to become part of a bigger picture or big society, as David Cameron called it at the time. Question 2. Outline and explain 3 ways in which governments have tried to tackle inequality in educational achievement. Okay, so again, this type of question, it's worth 6 marks. We've got to have 3 ways, so each way is worth 2 marks. You get 1 mark for identifying and 1 mark for explaining how it's tried to tackle inequality. So it says ways, not policies, right? I've used policies here, but if you looked at a way, you would probably still get credited for it. It's better to go with a policy, I think, though, because it shows you've got a better understanding of the question. One way governments have used educational policy to try and tackle inequality is through adopting policies which gave schools additional funding for pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, I've not mentioned a specific policy there, but I would get 1 mark. Policies that encourage funding, I would get the mark for that. I have, however, mentioned a specific policy in my explanation. Policies such as pupil premium address the material disadvantages that some pupils face by giving schools additional resources for books, laptops and other educational resources so that disadvantaged pupils would have access to them. If I hadn't mentioned pupil premium, that would still get 2 out of 2 because it's not asking you for 3 policies, it's asking you for 3 ways. A second way that governments have tried to tackle inequality in educational achievement is through the creation of comprehensive schools. There's my 1 mark. This aimed to tackle the disparity between grammar schools and secondary moderns by bringing all students together under the same roof with the same access to teaching, subjects and self-esteem. Again, there's my +1. It's quite easy when you think about it this way, is identify and then explain. So a brief explanation. A final way in which governments have looked to tackle inequality in educational achievement is through EMA, or Education Maintenance Allowance. EMA was a means-tested allowance that encouraged pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds to continue in education beyond the then compulsory school leaving age of 16 in order to give them more opportunities to succeed. So another thing I've talked about here is I've said more opportunities to succeed. So that's part of my explanation, is explaining how it aimed to tackle educational underachievement. Okay, so there's 3 reasons there. Other reasons you could have looked at, because it talks about inequality, it's not necessarily social class inequality, it can be ethnic inequality or it can be gender inequality. You could have looked at policies that tackled either of those. So you could have looked at New Labour's idea of being more multicultural and introducing new subjects into the curriculum. You could look at the growth of academies, the introduction of things like GIST and WISE for gender differences. You can talk about GCSEs and coursework, introduction of national curriculum, and you can even talk about sort of like how they try to tackle boys inequality through things like literacy programs or through changing the assessment back to a linear format. Okay, so let's look at the 10 marker. The 10 marker, as we usually do, is we try to pick out the hooks in the 10 marker from the item, and then what we will do is we will develop those into reasons that answer the question. So it says here, item A, according to Functionist, the purpose of education is to prepare pupils for their future roles in society. This can be achieved through the teaching of specific skills or through transmitting norms and values. So what can we pick out from this? Well, some of the things I've picked out here. Future roles in society. Yes, it is part of the question, but you can use that as part of the item. And what we've seen in the last couple of exam series is that the items are getting thinner. So and a lot broader. So there's lots more that you can pick out because they are, they're getting less. It's testing your skill of application, but they are getting a lot broader in what pieces of information you can use. Can be achieved through the teaching of specific skills. Okay, so teaching of specific skills, we can probably look here at things like the hidden curriculum, the correspondence principle, specialist skills, vocational education, or through transmitting norms and values. Now we can look at how the 3 different theories approach transmission of norms and values. So if we think about Functionists, they talk about transmitting value consensus or meritocracy. Marxists will take a very dim view of the transmission of norms and values. They will talk about hegemonic norms and values. They will talk about transmitting capitalist norms and values, the ideology of the ruling class. And feminists will talk about patriarchal norms and values and how they are transmitted. We can also talk about here about transmitting the idea of meritocracy versus the myth of meritocracy. And we can talk about role allocation from future roles in society. But we can also flip that around, look at the Marxist view and talk about the legitimization of inequality or the reproduction of inequality. Let's look what I've done for these 2 questions. One way in which education prepares people for their future roles in society is through transmitting norms and values, and in brackets, item A. I've mentioned this in every video so far, so I'm going to keep on mentioning it. When you do a 10 marker like this, always signpost to the examiner that you've used the item and then develop that point on. Some people will say, oh, well, you can get away with it if it's implicit use. Don't take the chance. It's one line that you put in to sort of like say that you've referred to the item, and it makes sure that any examiner that sees it will know this student has referred to the item. While Functionists would argue this is done for the benefit of pupils, socialising them into the value consensus of society, both Marxists and feminists would argue that it socialises pupils into the dominant norms and values of society and prepares them for future exploitation. Marxists will argue that this is done through promoting values of capitalism, such as hard work and individualism, which leads to pupils rejecting other commitments, such as solidarity with their peers, in order to achieve higher status for themselves. Feminists, on the other hand, would suggest that the norms and values that are transmitted by education prepares female pupils for a life of subordination in a patriarchal society. This is achieved through sifting girls into lower value expressive subjects and reinforcing the idea that females should be passive and subservient. Both Marxists and feminists argue that the transmission of these norms and values sets up pupils for their future roles as being subservient to the ruling class and men respectively. Now, some people will think, right, okay, you've not mentioned any studies. Well, one of the ways in which you can analyse is by doing a comparison and contrast. So what I've done is I've taken these different theoretical approaches and I've compared and contrasted them. So I've put forward the functionist idea, I've shown how the Marxists would disagree with it, I've shown how feminists would disagree with it, I've done a compare and contrast, and that gives me a really good demonstration of my understanding of the concept that we're talking about, transmission of norms and values. On to my second way. Well, a second way in which education prepares pupils for their future roles is by teaching them specific skills. Item A. Mention a little bit of theory here with Durkheim. Durkheim argued that one of the main functions of the education system was to teach pupils the specialist skills required for the complex division of labour in modern society. As such, schools focus on providing pupils with skills for employment, either through academic routes, such as A-levels, with students learning information that will enable them to go on to university and more specialised study, or through vocational qualifications. These are aimed to enable pupils to gain experience in working in a specific sector, such as carpentry, vehicle repair, or health and social care. This leads to them having the skills in order to perform their roles adequately, and this enables the smooth running of society. However, critics such as Bowles and Gintis would suggest that instead of learning specialist skills, pupils are only prepared for the long shadow of work through what they called the correspondence principle. However, this also prepares pupils for their future roles, albeit by teaching them concepts such as hierarchy, fragmentation of information, and alienation, and is a less positive approach than that suggested by Durkheim. So I have used a bit of research in here, well, certainly theoretical research with Bowles and Gintis, and bringing in the idea of the correspondence theory, and again it is contrasting with Durkheim's idea. So I've gone for this compare and contrast way of analysing, putting forward one idea and then comparing another idea with it. I've also got a little bit of evaluation in here as well by suggesting that Bowles and Gintis disagree with Durkheim's ideas, and then the impact of it at the bottom. However, this also prepares pupils for their future roles. This is applying my knowledge to the specific question. Okay, so that concludes the whole education section of the 2022 challenge. We will look at methods in context a little bit later on, where I'll be doing one 20-mark question on methods in context, usually in the final week of this challenge, because the 20 markers take a little bit more time. Now we've moved on to theory and methods. So the question for day 6, which will be March the 7th, is outline and explain 2 reasons sociologists may prefer to use primary research methods when investigating sociological issues. Bit of a mouthful of a question, but it's asking you, why might sociologists prefer to do the research themselves rather than rely upon secondary sources? And this is almost like a flipped way of looking at a question that was asked a few years ago about why sociologists use secondary sources. The second question is outline and explain 2 explanations why sociology should be used to inform social policy. This one's probably a little bit trickier because there's lots of information there about why sociology doesn't or shouldn't inform social policy. We're now looking for 2 explanations for why sociology should be used to inform social policy. What I'm going to try to do this week with the theory and methods ones is I'm going to try and focus on one question on methods and one question on one of the kind of theoretical debates. So this is sociology as a science, sociology and social policy, are we living in a postmodern age, value freedom, those type of things, whereas the first one will be on research methods and maybe choice of methods and choice of topics. This will be looking at the 10-mark questions on paper 1 and paper 3. Of course, we know with theory and methods that you're going to get asked a 20-mark question on consensus or conflict, structural social action theories. Best of luck for the week ahead.